Welcome to Midnight Grove, where stories flow as gently as rivers, and each journey leads you quietly inward. Tonight's tale is The Ferryman's Last Passenger, a story about bridges that appear in the rain, rivers that remember your steps, and the quiet weight of the moments we leave behind. Amelia has spent her life moving forward, never slowing, never looking back. But one evening, as the rain falls and the streets shift under her feet, she finds herself standing before a bridge she doesn't remember crossing. On the far side waits a ferryman, and a choice she didn't know she needed to make. So settle in, close your eyes, and let yourself drift with the current. This story is not about changing the past, but understanding how far you've come. The Ferryman's Last Passenger. Chapter 1. The Bridge in the Rain. The rain had been falling for hours. It wasn't a light drizzle, the kind that made the pavement shimmer, but a steady, insistent downpour that blurred the streetlights and made everything seem half-dreamed. Amelia pulled her coat tighter around her as she walked, head down, shoes splashing through puddles she barely noticed. She hadn't meant to be out this late, but when she left the little cafe hours ago, something had kept her wandering. Maybe it was the silence she knew waited at home. Maybe it was the lingering heaviness in her chest she couldn't shake. Or maybe it was the simple fact that she didn't feel quite ready to stop moving. She was always moving. Moving past conversations, past mistakes, past places she didn't want to look back at. It was easier to keep going forward. That's what everyone said, wasn't it? Keep moving, don't look back. But tonight felt different. But the streets she walked down weren't familiar. Not exactly. Though she'd lived in this town for years, she couldn't quite place where she was now. The buildings felt older here, the lamplight dimmer, and as the rain poured heavier, she noticed something else. Ahead of her, stretching across a narrow river she didn't recall ever seeing before, was a bridge, a long-arched bridge made of worn stone and dark wooden planks slick with rain. Amelia slowed. Something about it felt out of place. It didn't match the rest of the town, the newer streets, the concrete sidewalks, and yet here it stood, unmarked, silent, lit faintly by lanterns swaying in the wind. At the far end of the bridge, she could just make out the outline of someone standing beneath one of the lanterns. A figure, still and patient, their posture calm as if they had been waiting for her all along. The rain slid down the collar of her coat, cold against her skin, but she barely noticed now. Her feet had already begun moving, almost without her permission, toward the bridge. The air felt heavier the closer she drew, the sound of the rain muffled by something she couldn't quite name. When she reached the first wooden plank, she hesitated. The river beneath was dark, slow-moving, reflecting no light, and the figure at the far end shifted, stepping forward just enough to meet her eyes across the distance. A man dressed in a long, simple coat, a broad-brimmed hat shadowing much of his face. But even from here she could see. He was watching her, waiting. Amelia took another cautious step onto the bridge. The old wood beneath her shoes groaned softly but held. The lanterns above flickered, casting golden pools of light that barely touched the dark water below. She glanced back once. The street behind her seemed to have faded into shadows, quiet, distant. There was no sound of cars, no echo of footsteps, only the rain and the steady hum of the river, and the figure at the far end. As she drew closer, she could finally make out the man more clearly. His face was calm, unreadable, older but not aged in the way she expected. Like someone caught between years, he inclined his head slightly as she stopped in front of him. For a moment neither of them spoke. "Then, you've come for a crossing," he said simply. Amelia blinked, her fingers tightening around her coat. "A crossing?" The man nodded almost gently. He turned slightly, motioning toward a small boat tethered to the side of the bridge. Simple weathered wood. A lantern hung at its bow, swaying gently. "The river doesn't show itself to everyone," he said quietly. "But when it does, it means you're ready to step across." "But—" Amelia swallowed. "Ready?" She shook her head faintly, forcing a weak smile. "I'm not sure where this even leads," she murmured, half laughing under her breath. The ferryman watched her for a long moment. His expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes softened. No one ever is. The river below rippled faintly, the surface barely disturbed by the falling rain. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Amelia's heart was pounding harder now. Not from fear, not from cold, but from something else. A quiet recognition deep inside her chest, as if she had stood on this bridge before and had simply forgotten. "What's on the other side?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now. The ferryman tilted his head slightly. "That depends on what you've left behind." Amelia felt a lump tighten in her throat. She glanced down at the boat, the river, the lantern swaying gently overhead. Some part of her wanted to turn back, to retrace her steps to familiar streets, to lights, to noise. But she knew, even if she turned around now, the road would not look the same. The man's gaze didn't waver. He held out his hand. "Come aboard when you're ready. The river will wait." Amelia stood there for what felt like minutes, maybe longer, the sound of the rain softening around her ears. Her eyes flicked between the ferryman's outstretched hand and the boat swaying gently beside the bridge. She had no reason to trust him, no idea where the boat would take her. And yet there was something undeniably calm about him, something that seemed to quiet the restless ache she had carried for so long. Without fully realizing it, she stepped forward. Her fingers brushed his hand. Cool, steady grounding. The ferryman nodded once and guided her down the narrow steps leading from the bridge to the small vessel. Amelia settled onto one of the benches, the lantern's glow casting soft shadows across the planks. The ferryman untied the rope and pushed them gently away from the shore. But the boat drifted soundlessly. The river was smooth beneath them, dark like glass, reflecting almost nothing. The lantern at the bow swung softly, its light trailing across the surface of the water. Neither of them spoke at first. The air felt hushed, not uncomfortable but expectant, like they were both waiting to see what would surface. Finally, after a stretch of silence, the ferryman spoke. "The river shows different things to each person who crosses. Amelia glanced at him. "What does it show?" she asked quietly. His gaze remained steady on the water ahead. Things left behind. Things forgotten. Moments you've walked past without looking back. He turned his head slightly, his voice softer now. "You've carried more of them than you realize." But Amelia felt something shift in her chest. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap, feeling the weight of that truth settle gently. She didn't need to ask how he knew, because deep down she already felt it. This quiet tug beneath her ribs, pulling her towards something she hadn't yet faced. The river rippled faintly as they glided forward, and slowly, the darkness beneath the water began to shift. But at first it was faint, like shadows moving beneath the surface. But then shapes began to appear, vague outlines, blurred at the edges but unmistakably familiar. A table set for two, an unread letter left on a windowsill, a train platform, empty except for one figure waiting. Amelia's breath caught. She knew these moments, could feel them like echoes pressing at the edges of her memory. Things she had forgotten not by accident, but by choice. Moments she had walked away from. Things left unsaid. The ferryman said nothing. He only watched her quietly as the river offered up her own life piece by piece. The boat drifted on, each ripple in the water revealing more. Faces she hadn't seen in years flickered beneath the surface, some smiling, some turned away. A doorway left ajar, a younger version of herself standing at a crossroads, hesitation written all over her expression. Amelia gripped the edge of the bench, her chest tight. It was strange how these moments felt both distant and impossibly close, like a book she'd once read but never finished. She glanced at the ferryman, his silhouette steady beside her. "Why is the river showing me these?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze. "Because you never crossed them." But Amelia swallowed hard, eyes returning to the water. She hadn't realized how much she'd avoided. All the conversations she left unfinished, the choices she made in silence, walking away without a backward glance. It hadn't seemed like avoidance at the time, just life moving forward. But now, sitting here watching those moments float by beneath the lantern's glow, she understood. Every step she took away had gathered behind her, and the river carried them all. But the rain had lessened. The sound of water against water grew softer, almost rhythmic. Ahead, she saw the faint outline of another shoreline, barely lit by the hazy glow of distant lamps. The ferryman's voice broke the quiet. "You don't have to go all the way across." Amelia blinked. He turned toward her, expression unreadable but kind. Some people choose to step off halfway. Some turn back before they reach the end. Others stay in the river as long as they need. He paused, then added softly, "The choice is always yours." But Amelia exhaled, her breath fogging in the cool air. The boat glided forward, the river slowing now as if waiting for her to decide. She could feel it, the weight of the years behind her, the quiet pull of the water beneath, not demanding, not forcing, simply offering. The ferryman's lantern flickered gently, casting circles of light across the surface. For the first time in a long while, she felt still. And as the boat drifted onward, Amelia realized she didn't know yet if she wanted to reach the far shore, or if she needed to. All she knew was she wasn't ready to turn back. Not yet. Chapter 2, The River of Forgotten Moments. The boat moved slowly now, gliding as if the water beneath them had turned to glass. The rain had softened into mist, clinging to Amelia's coat, her hair, her breath. For a while neither she nor the ferryman spoke. The river hummed quietly around them, its surface still revealing flickers of memory. Faces, places, conversations she had long since let drift away. Amelia watched in silence. It felt strangely peaceful, not jarring, not painful, more like opening an old forgotten book and finding the pages already familiar. She leaned slightly forward, her voice soft. "Do people usually regret it?" The ferryman didn't look at her, his gaze steady ahead. "Crossing?" he asked. She nodded. He shook his head slowly. "Most regret not looking." But the boat shifted gently beneath them as they passed another moment shimmering just beneath the water's surface. A younger version of herself again, standing by a window. She was speaking, but no sound reached Amelia now. She strained to listen, to recall, but it faded. The ferryman's voice came quietly. "The river doesn't replay everything, only what still belongs to you." But Amelia stared down at her reflection. For a long time she had carried this vague sense that something had been missing, like she was moving too quickly past the things that mattered, or avoiding the quiet spaces where her own thoughts echoed a little too loudly. And now here on this quiet river, she could feel it settling. All those small decisions, those silences left hanging between people, those doors she never opened. They floated here, calm, unjudging, waiting. The mist swirled gently as the boat glided on. Amelia let her fingers trail along the bench beside her, feeling the grain of the worn wood damp beneath her touch. There was something grounding about the quiet, the way each ripple in the river seemed to echo a memory rather than disturb it. Every few moments she caught glimpses beneath the surface. A park bench, the curve of a handwritten letter, a hand reaching for hers that she had never quite taken. The ferryman steered calmly, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. Finally, Amelia spoke again, her voice barely above the sound of water lapping at the sides of the boat. "What happens if I don't recognize all the moments?" The ferryman didn't hesitate. "Some were never meant to be remembered clearly. They left their mark whether you recall them or not." She swallowed, staring down at the flickering images. "What if I don't want to look back?" This time he met her eyes. "You already are." But they drifted in silence once more. The far shore was still faint in the distance, shrouded by fog and darkness. The air carried the faintest scent of rain-soaked earth and river reeds, mingling with something older, something more intangible. The ferry passed beneath an arching tree branch, its bare limbs trailing like fingers into the water. Beneath the surface, Amelia saw another vision. A kitchen table, sunlight falling across worn wood, the sound of laughter echoing faintly. Her throat tightened. It had been years since she'd thought of that moment. And yet here it was, still waiting beneath the surface. They passed under another lantern, its glow soft, casting shifting shadows across her lap. The ferryman spoke again, his voice steady. "You've left many things behind, Amelia." She glanced up, startled at the sound of her name. But he didn't explain how he knew. She found she wasn't surprised. "We all do," she murmured, brushing a lock of damp hair behind her ear. The ferryman inclined his head. "The river isn't about regret. It's about what still lingers." But the boat slowed, nearing a quiet bend where the riverbank curved inward. The water here was clearer, revealing more than before. This time Amelia saw something she hadn't expected. Herself standing in a hallway, suitcase in hand. Someone behind her calling her name. Her shoulders tense, her face turned away. She stared, her breath catching. She remembered that moment. Or at least she thought she had forgotten it. It had been easier not to dwell on the doors she had closed. But here the river offered no judgment, only reflection. The ferryman remained silent, letting her watch. But as they drifted past, Amelia's gaze lingered on the fading image until it dissolved back into the dark current. The boat rocked gently beneath her. "Why is it showing me this now?" she asked, voice low. The ferryman's eyes remained fixed ahead. "Because now you're ready to see it." But the fog ahead shifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of another bridge in the distance. Or perhaps just the memory of one. Amelia sat back, feeling the weight of the river settle deeper into her chest. All this time, she had been running forward. But here on the slow-moving water, she felt herself standing still, not trapped, not frozen, simply present. But the ferryman spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You can choose how far you want to go. You can step off the boat whenever you wish." Amelia looked ahead, then back toward the shore they had left behind. It felt so distant now. "What happens if I go all the way?" The ferryman's eyes met hers, calm and unwavering. "You'll understand what was never really left behind." But the river curved gently, the boat following without effort. Another memory flickered beneath them. A letter never sent. A conversation she'd meant to have, but postponed until the moment slipped away. She watched it pass, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Her heartbeat slowed. For the first time, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. But they continued onward, the lantern swinging softly at the bow. The mist thickened again, curling around them like a blanket. Amelia leaned back, letting the quiet of the river fill her. The ferryman's voice reached her once more. "We don't cross to change the past, Amelia. We cross to make peace with it." But as the boat drifted forward, she closed her eyes and let herself drift too. Chapter 3: The Crossing Backward. The river's surface was almost perfectly still now, save for the gentle ripples trailing behind the boat. Amelia sat in silence, feeling the rhythm of the water beneath her. It no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt like something she'd known all along, but never stopped to notice. The ferryman hadn't spoken for a while. He stood at the helm, guiding them with ease, the lantern's light catching in the folds of his coat as it swayed. Every so often she glanced at him, wondering how long he'd been guiding passengers. How many had stepped aboard without realizing where they were going? She wondered how many had turned back. But the fog had lifted slightly. Ahead, the faint outline of the far shore appeared. Not fully visible, but there. Something waited there. She could feel it. But it wasn't pulling her urgently. There was no rush. The river moved at its own pace, and so did she. But beneath the water, the shifting images began to quiet. Not gone, simply settled. Each one she had passed earlier, faces, letters, doors unopened, felt like it had been acknowledged. Not resolved, but no longer hidden. Amelia exhaled, shoulders relaxing. The weight she'd carried so long was not erased, but it was no longer pressing quite as hard. But the ferryman finally spoke again, his voice breaking the quiet without disturbing it. "You've seen much of what you left behind." She nodded faintly, watching the distant shoreline. "I didn't think it would feel like this," she admitted. "Like what?" She hesitated. "Like nothing is asking me to fix it." But the ferryman's gaze stayed on the horizon. "That's not what the river is for." He let the words hang for a moment, then continued. "It doesn't demand that you go back and change what's already past. It offers you the chance to finally face it." Amelia swallowed. "And what happens if I do?" The ferryman's eyes met hers. "Then it stops chasing you." But they drifted in silence a little longer, the sound of the water like a steady heartbeat beneath them. Ahead, the fog cleared further, revealing more of the opposite shore. Amelia could make out the faint curve of trees, shadows moving gently beyond. And then she saw something else. A figure standing at the edge of the water, unmoving. At first, she thought it might be another ferryman waiting at the far dock. But as they drew closer, her breath caught. It wasn't a stranger. It was herself, a younger version. Not as she was now, but as she had been once, standing still, looking back at the river. Amelia's heart pounded softly. The ferryman said nothing. The boat slowed, drifting closer to the far shore. Her younger self stood there calmly, as if she had been waiting all along. Not hurried, not lost, simply waiting. But the ferryman spoke quietly beside her. "This is the moment you never crossed." Amelia's throat tightened. She didn't need to ask which moment. She knew it was the choice she never made. The conversation she never had. The path she turned away from because she wasn't ready. But here now, she could see that it had never disappeared. It had remained standing patiently, waiting for her to look back. The ferryman's voice remained calm, steady. "You can step off now if you wish, or continue past." Amelia stared at the figure on the shore. Herself, frozen in that moment, not demanding anything from her, simply offering recognition. But the boat rocked gently. Her breath came slow. "And if I step off?" she asked softly. The ferryman didn't answer immediately. "Then you'll find that you're no longer standing in that moment." But she glanced down at the water, its surface smooth, reflecting her face faintly. All the weight she'd carried, the moments avoided, the conversations left unspoken. They had gathered not to trap her, but to remind her. They had shaped her, whether she faced them or not. But she inhaled deeply, then stood. Her movements weren't rushed. There was no urgency, no fear. The ferryman watched quietly as she stepped toward the edge of the boat, her shoes light against the worn wood. The figure on the shore didn't move, but as the boat gently touched the far dock, Amelia felt something inside her loosen. But she turned once, meeting the ferryman's calm gaze. "Will I see you again?" she asked softly. His lips curved faintly. "The river is always here, but you only need to cross it when you forget who you are." But Amelia nodded, stepping onto the dock. The air felt still. Her younger self remained at the river's edge, not waiting anymore. Simply part of the landscape. But the fog began to lift further. The trees swayed quietly, and beyond them a path opened gently into something unseen. She took a breath and walked forward. Chapter 4: The Other Side of the River. The path beyond the dock stretched quietly ahead, winding between slender trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. The rain had stopped altogether now, leaving the air cool and fresh, the faint scent of river water clinging to everything. Amelia walked slowly. Each step felt deliberate but not heavy. Behind her the ferry remained at the water's edge, its lantern still glowing faintly, though she knew she wouldn't need to board it again. The sound of the river grew softer as she moved further away, as if it had finally released her from whatever had kept her drifting for so long. But the trees thinned after a time, revealing a clearing bathed in muted light. The ground was soft beneath her shoes, and she paused at the edge, glancing back once. The dock, the boat, the ferryman, all still there but distant now. And on the far side of the river, she could just make out the faint outline of the bridge where she had first stepped aboard. It felt like a lifetime ago. The clearing ahead was simple, a quiet open space with nothing remarkable at first glance. But as she walked to its center, she saw something unexpected. A single bench facing the riverbank she had come from. And on the bench, a small book rested, its cover soft with age. Amelia approached, her fingers brushing the worn surface. She sat down slowly, the quiet of the clearing settling around her like a familiar blanket. But she opened the book. The pages inside were blank. At first she frowned. Was it unfinished? But as she turned each page, she realized this book wasn't meant to hold her past. It was meant to hold whatever came next. But the ferryman's words echoed faintly in her memory. The river doesn't ask you to change the past. It offers you the chance to face it. And now, that past no longer weighed on her shoulders. She had stood in front of it, watched it drift by, quiet and undemanding, and in doing so, she had crossed it. But Amelia closed the book gently. The path beyond the clearing stretched onward, unmarked, open. She stood, glancing back one final time at the river. The boat remained still, the ferryman's silhouette faint against the mist. But he did not call to her. There was no need. But she took a breath, the cool air filling her lungs. Her heart felt steady. The restless ache she'd carried for so long now softened. Quiet. There was no need to rush. No need to keep moving just to outrun something unseen. She stepped forward, and the path welcomed her like an old friend. And as she walked away from the river, Amelia understood. The crossing had never been about the other side. It had always been about allowing herself to pause, to stop, to look back, and to realize there was nothing left chasing her. Thank you for joining us tonight at Midnight Grove for the ferryman's last passenger. Amelia thought the river would ask her to fix something, but all it wanted was for her to finally stop running, to let the quiet catch up to her, and to leave her burdens resting gently on the water. As you drift into sleep, remember, you don't have to cross every bridge right away. Some crossings are meant to remind you how far you've already traveled. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another story.